Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. In today's video, we're going to be discussing one of the most hated characters from the entire series. No, it's not Vernon Dursley, and no, it's not Voldemort, it's none other than Dolores Jane Umbridge, Hogwarts High Inquisitor, proud ministry employee, and head of the Muggle-Born Registration Commission. More specifically, however, we're going to be digging into Umbridge's past and uncovering her humble beginnings. Was she always awful? Who were her parents? Where did she grow up? Why was she so prejudiced? Sit back, relax, and enjoy the life of Dolores Jane Umbridge. Now, before we get started, I just want to refute one thing. Umbridge did not hail from the Selwyn family. In the Deathly Hallows, while serving as head of the Muggle-Born Registration Commission, Dolores claimed that the S on the necklace around her neck stood for Selwyn. That's pretty, Dolores, she said, pointing at the pendant gleaming in the ruffled folds of Umbridge's blouse. What? Snapped Umbridge, glancing down. Oh yes, an old family heirloom, she said, patting the locket lying on her large bosom. The S stands for Selwyn. I'm related to the Selwyns, indeed. There are few pureblood families to whom I am not related. While this was probably more of a distraction tactic rather than a genuine claim, she still said it, and I want to make it perfectly clear that Umbridge was not related to the Selwyns. In fact, she wasn't related to any pureblood families at all. The truth is, Umbridge was a half-blood, part of her existence that she tried very hard to hide. Dolores Umbridge was a British half-blood witch born sometime before the year 1965. Before 1965 is a bit vague, but that's all we're given, so she could have been 31 when starting working at Hogwarts, or 61, it's quite unclear. She was a short woman with a broad flabby face, little neck and slack mouth, resembling a toad. She was born in the British Isles to one magical and one muggle parent. Her family was quite small. Her father was a wizard by the name of Orford Umbridge, and her mother was a muggle named Ellen Cracknell, and her younger brother's name is never actually revealed. Isn't it interesting how the department head for the Muggle-Born Registration Commission was in fact a Muggle-born herself? Dolores' family and home life was already very dysfunctional, and so it didn't help that her father, her magical parent, had very little ambition, perfectly happy to work as a floor mopper at the Ministry of Magic. Later in life, when Dolores worked at the ministry herself, she was occasionally questioned about her relationship to the floor mopper at the ministry, a connection that she would vehemently deny. In fact, it's later revealed that those who did question her identity, or her father's, almost always had nasty things happen to them. Nasty things tended to happen to people who asked about Orford, or anything that Dolores did not like talking about, and people who wanted to remain on her good side pretended to believe her version of her ancestry. I'm sure you can only imagine what a terrible and judgmental person like Umbridge would think of a floor mopper. However, Dolores wasn't the root cause of all of the issues in her family. In fact, I think it was her father that ended up being the root cause of the family's problems, as he actively blamed Dolores' mother for birthing a squib. The squib in question, of course, being Dolores' brother, whose name is never revealed. Despite having very little ambition, having a squib child was a source of shame for him, and the main focal point for all of the family's troubles. This was undoubtedly an unhealthy environment for Dolores to grow up in, and I have no doubt that it contributed to turning her into the dysfunctional woman that she would become. I'll continue discussing her family later on, but for now, let's jump into Umbridge's earlier years and her proper introduction to magic. Like so many before and after her, at age 11 it was time for Umbridge to start planning to head to Hogwarts, the finest school of witchcraft and wizardry in the world, at least according to Hagrid. When they come of age, all young witches and wizards should expect a Hogwarts acceptance letter, even the ones like Umbridge. The Hogwarts acceptance letter informs new students of their acceptance to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and along with the letter includes a list of required textbooks and materials required for the upcoming school year. From this point, students are required to travel to Diagon Alley and purchase the materials, one of the most important pieces of kit, of course, being a wand. For this particular item, students know exactly where to go. Ollivander's wand shop. As we all know, the wand chooses the witch or wizard, and what's even more interesting is that you can actually derive a lot about someone's personality from their wand. When it came time for a wand to choose Dolores, she ended up with an 8-inch birch wand with a dragon heartstring core. The first thing that should pop out to you here is that Dolores' wand is abnormally short, particularly as Ollivander chiefly gives out wands between 9 and 15 inches in length. While this short wand wouldn't mean much coming from another wand maker, it actually signifies a lot coming from Ollivander. Wand makers often match the wand length to the height of the witch or wizard who will use it, but Ollivander considers this measure inadequate. In his experience, longer than average wands tend to be drawn to those with a physical peculiarity or a bigger personality, whereas abnormally short wands select people whose character lacks in something. What this tells us is that even at age 11, Dolores' character was stunted, especially morally, or lacked something. A short wand, particularly an abnormally short wand, is certainly no compliment. After collecting all of her school supplies, it was time for Umbridge to head off to school, to Hogwarts, and so she travelled to platform 9 3/4, just like all of the other children her age. After arriving at Hogwarts, it wasn't long before the sorting ceremony began, the ceremony that decides which Hogwarts house you best fit into. What I'm sure won't surprise any of you is that Umbridge was sorted into Slytherin house, the house most commonly associated with those that were morally dubious. Umbridge was a good student and took school very seriously, but because she clashed with her head of house, Horace Slughorn, she was never awarded any positions of power, i.e. prefect, head girl, etc., despite possibly being deserving of those positions. While she certainly isn't charming to any degree, Slughorn really didn't take to her, and once described her as an idiotic woman. Her inability to garner any positions of power or additional responsibility at the school, in spite of her work ethic, meant that Umbridge never enjoyed her time at Hogwarts. Meanwhile, home life for Umbridge was difficult as well, and she grew to hate each of her parents more and more as she grew older. In fact, the constant internal struggles that the family faced eventually split them up. Dolores' parents were unhappily married, and Dolores secretly despised both of them. Orford for his lack of ambition, he had never been promoted and worked in the Department of Magical Maintenance at the Ministry of Magic, and her mother, Ellen, for her flightiness, untidiness, and Muggle lineage. Both Orford and his daughter blamed Ellen for Dolores' brother's lack of magical ability, with the result that when Dolores was 15, the family split down the middle, Orford and Dolores remaining together, and Ellen vanishing back into the Muggle world with her son. Dolores never saw her mother or brother again, never spoke of either of them, and henceforth pretended to all she met that she was a pureblood. The family split while Umbridge was still studying at Hogwarts at age 15, but at this stage she hated them all so much that it didn't really matter. Instead of being sad about it, she just continued to focus on her studies in the pursuit of one day achieving some level of power. I do wonder though, how the split would have affected her mentally, as by the time she was 15, she would have known her brother quite well. Not seeing them ever again must have been tough. But then again, this is Dolores Umbridge we're talking about. After graduating from Hogwarts, Umbridge finally had an opportunity to receive recognition for her work ethic. During her time at Hogwarts, her growth was stunted by Slughorn, largely because he didn't like her, but when she secured a job at the Ministry of Magic, she climbed the ranks quickly. She started off as an intern at the Improper Use of Magic office, and by the time she was 30, 10 or so years later, she became head of that same department. Umbridge achieved this role while still very young, largely due to a combination of 3 things: strong work ethic, ruthlessness, and an outwardly sweet demeanor when important. However, despite having a strong work ethic, she certainly didn't play by the rules, and would often take credit for other people's work. She was known for tyrannizing her subordinates, who she felt could offer nothing to her, and being overly flattering towards her superiors, in the hopes that it would further advance her career. Basically, she was a suck-up, but the sweet side that she would show to her superiors was of course entirely contrived. Of course, working at the ministry also meant that she now worked in the same place as her father, but as I mentioned earlier, she denied any affiliation with him. In fact, she actually paid him off, offering him a monthly allowance to simply get out of public sight. She didn't want to risk any connections being made. This was the beginning of Dolores' outrageous claims regarding her pureblood status. With her father gone and her ruthless nature, she continued to climb the ranks of the ministry, eventually becoming senior undersecretary to the Minister for Magic, even earning herself a spot in the Wizengamot. One thing that I've always found interesting is how Umbridge established herself and got started in the ministry without her identity ever being properly questioned. In a world that had only just recently begun to accept half-bloods and Muggle-Borns as part of their society, it's curious that Umbridge got by the way that she did. Had she tried to enter the ministry a century sooner, it's untelling how that would have gone for her. While working at the ministry, Dolores did any and everything she could to rise to the top of the career ladder, and this included looking for a potential partner. Repeatedly, Umbridge tried to garner the affections of one of her superiors in order to elevate her status, but everyone at the Ministry found it quite difficult to like her. In fact, her prejudiced viewpoint towards certain groups, basically anyone that wasn't a pure-blood human wizard, started to become obvious. In fact, in 1993, Umbridge passed anti-werewolf legislation, and in 1994 started a campaign calling for merpeople to be rounded up and tagged. Soon, Umbridge would begin at Hogwarts, but before that happened, we also of course need to remember the incident in Little Whinging involving Dementors. You see, since becoming Undersecretary to the Minister for Magic, Fudge, Umbridge became reasonably close with him, only because they worked directly together. As Umbridge was a little bit deceitful and undercutting, she took advantage of Fudge's paranoia surrounding the return of the Dark Lord, and took action to take care of Harry Potter, who was insistent that Voldemort had returned. In order to silence Harry, she anonymously ordered the Dementor attack on Dudley and Harry in Little Whinging. By sending Dementors there, she knew that she would get her desired result either way. If the Dementors successfully kissed Harry, then great, he would keep his mouth shut. And if Harry used a Patronus charm to get rid of them, then he could be expelled for using magic in the presence of a Muggle. It was a win-win for Umbridge, except not, because Harry didn't end up getting expelled. You see, despite her presence at Harry's trial, the court ended up voting in Harry's favour, and the charges were dropped. However, this wasn't the last that Harry saw of Umbridge, as not long after, at Hogwarts of all places, they met again. In 1995, disaster struck Hogwarts, for you see, it was this year that Umbridge was appointed as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor. Umbridge was a poor teacher, mainly because she taught her own biased and ineffective curriculum. However, she didn't act in this role alone for long, as she was eventually appointed as Hogwarts' first ever High Inquisitor, a position that she used to harass students and peers. However, this power still wasn't enough for Umbridge, as Dumbledore was still technically in charge. He was headmaster. During this time, the Ministry, namely Fudge, and Dumbledore were continually butting heads. Fudge was lashing out, he was blinded by fear, and in utter denial that the Dark Lord Voldemort had returned. Dumbledore continually tried to convince Fudge of the truth, but his efforts were futile, and Fudge continued to punish Dumbledore in whatever way he could. Eventually, Dolores Umbridge and her inquisitorial squad discovered the headquarters of Dumbledore's army in the Room of Requirement. Dumbledore's army was of course formed by Harry and had nothing to do with Dumbledore, but with Dumbledore's name in the group's name, fingers started to get pointed at him. Dumbledore happily took responsibility for the formation of the group, claiming that it was all his idea and that no student should be punished in his place. After a minor scuffle with Umbridge, some auras, and Fudge, Dumbledore eventually left Hogwarts. This left the school without a headmaster. At this point, Umbridge passed Educational Decree No. 28, which effectively replaced Dumbledore with Umbridge. Umbridge was headmistress of Hogwarts. This was a dark, dark time for the school, arguably as dark as when Snape took over, but fortunately, it didn't last long. Umbridge ran a tight ship at Hogwarts, which meant that not a lot of illicit activity went unnoticed. So when Umbridge eventually saw an opportunity to punish Harry for something, she jumped on it, and even threatened him with the Cruciatus Curse. In order to prevent Harry from basically being tortured by the school's new headmistress, Hermione decided to distract Umbridge by mentioning a secret weapon of the Order of the Phoenix. From here, Umbridge was tricked into travelling to the Forbidden Forest with Harry and Hermione, at which point they were confronted by a group of centaurs. Umbridge, arrogant and prejudiced as ever, didn't back down in their presence and began to attack them. This only angered the centaurs, who already didn't like Umbridge, even more, and they subsequently snapped her wand in half and captured her. Umbridge was eventually saved by Dumbledore, who the centaurs came to respect, though she did hold a substantial fear of centaurs for the rest of her life. With the irrefutable evidence pointing to Voldemort's return, Dumbledore was reappointed as headmaster, and much to the joy of the Hogwarts population, Umbridge no longer had anything to do with the school. Amazingly, however, Umbridge still found herself with a job after leaving Hogwarts. In fact, the Ministry accepted her back in her previous role of Senior Undersecretary to the Minister of Magic. Also, at this stage, the Ministry had a new minister, Rufus Scrimgeour. Despite a brief appearance at Dumbledore's funeral, the next we hear of Umbridge is in 1997, following Voldemort's takeover of the Ministry. In addition to her primary position of Undersecretary, Umbridge also became head of the Muggle-Born Registration Commission, where she conducted trials that were effectively designed to prosecute Muggle-borns. While working at the Ministry under Voldemort's regime, Umbridge wore a locket around her neck, a locket which turned out to be the locket of Salazar Slytherin, the Horcrux. She received the locket as a bribe from Mundungus Fletcher and didn't really know of its significance or of the fact that it was affecting her behavior. It made an already insufferable person that much worse, and it only strengthened her extremist ideals and hatred toward groups which she disliked. She claimed that the locket was an heirloom, and that the S stood for Selwyn, the name of a known pureblood family. But this was of course a lie, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video. Eventually, while working in her new role, Umbridge once again came face to face with Hermione, Ron, and Harry, who were disguised as Ministry employees. They arrived at the active hearing of Muggle-Born witch Mary Cattermole, who was being unfairly prosecuted by Umbridge. Unable to contain his anger any longer, Harry ended up attacking Umbridge and Corbin Yaxley with a stunning spell, which allowed the trio to steal the locket from around her neck and flee. Unfortunately, however, after the trio escaped, Umbridge was left with free rein to continue unfairly prosecuting Muggle-Born witches and wizards, and presumably she did so with a newfound fury, having been bested by the trio once again. Umbridge doesn't appear much more in the story after this, as there are bigger problems in the wizarding world, Lord Voldemort. However, with Voldemort's eventual downfall, the Ministry once again came under control of normal witches and wizards, expunging all of Voldemort's followers from positions of power. The Ministry of Magic essentially underwent a reformation, headed by Kingsley Shacklebolt, who became the new Minister for Magic. Fully aware of the type of person that Umbridge was, and the crimes that she had committed during Voldemort's regime, Kingsley had Umbridge arrested, tried, convicted, and given a life sentence to the island fortress of Azkaban. Ah, don't you love a happy ending? And that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want more of these Life of style videos, then let me know in the comment section below. Until next time, you're a wizard, Harry!